And then the class list, managing the class list, because there are some things that you have to consider with that with this large of a class. So some of the best practices that I'll talk about are having countdown choices for the screen. In a small class with 23 students, you can kind of wait and make sure everybody has participated. You can't do that. You definitely need to do a countdown in a large lecture hall. You can't wait for every single person to click in. We also found that using numbers versus letters, and I guess this applies to both, is better for the students. They're more used to the number, the keypad layout, because it's like their cell phone, so they look for the number rather than looking for the letters. Also, choosing examples to discuss. In the media writing class, they often talk about different movies and different news stories. So what the instructor will do is they'll put up a slide and say, which movie do you want me to use to illustrate this concept? And the students will vote on the movies they've seen the most, and so then the instructor can use the movies that most of them have seen, so the example will have maximum impact for illustrating that particular concept to the audience. The on-the-fly slide, if there's rustling of papers or a lot of nonverbal feedback that indicates some sort of unrest, the on-the-fly slide can help check right there and then what's going on. Also preparing for exams, putting sample question up is something I do in small classes as well. Managing the list is much more intensive in a larger, and then obviously reporting through the interfacing PowerPoint, Excel, and WebCT are all useful things here. So this is a sample slide from that larger class, and something that you'll notice here is there's a counter down, a bubble down here for the number of students. In my small class, I don't put that on the slide. You've got such a limited amount of real estate here that you try to maximize what you put on there, because my students can see the toolbar up here. They can see the number of responses. Down here is something you have to do in a large lecture because that's way too small to see. You can't tell in this room, but if you were in a large lecture hall with 200 students, they can't see the number of responses. So you want to put that down there to allow them to know that. All right, and obviously correct answer indicator, you know about that. Here we can see that 45% got it right, so that's less than half. We would want to talk more about this question to our audience. Okay, also there's not a countdown ball drop on here, but as I mentioned, it's in the large lecture halls, it's very useful to have that countdown ball, because then the students, they know it's a game that they've got to hurry up and get in. You can't really leave the poll open until everybody's gotten in like you can in a small class. All right, so this is an example report for one particular presentation. So we can go through and look at which questions were answered correctly, and if you've used the reports, you're familiar with this and understand that this allows you to go in and look at what students are getting right and wrong on the quizzes that you give and kind of do some reflection later after the class if you need to go back and cover topics. The final report here, we can see where we can integrate all of this stuff. In the large lecture hall, it's much easier to do your entire gradebook in TurningPoint than it is in the small class. In this media writing class, it's mostly in-class participation and quizzes, and then just, I believe it's 3 exams that they use over the course of the semester. So it's easy to enter those 3 exam grades. But in a smaller class, you may have a lot more participation assignments or daily grades that are just pen and paper brainstorming types of things, or smaller group assignments that are a little bit more difficult to put into TurningPoint and base your entire gradebook off of that. However, in the large lecture hall, we found that's the easiest way to manage the data, is to do it all through the TurningPoint gradebook. So that would be an example final report for some students that we have. All right, so some final thoughts on best practices. Again, make a countdown choice for the screen. Choose the numbers versus letters. Choosing the examples to discuss. You can really tailor your examples. You all are experts in your areas, so you have a lot of different ways that you can explain those things to your students. So finding out what's relevant to the students. There's a thing that comes out each year that many of you are probably familiar with that talks about what your incoming freshman class doesn't know about. Things like the Vietnam War is now as foreign and as long ago to them as World War II. So one example I use each semester is about the Challenger explosion. They weren't born when I talk about that. Unfortunately, the Columbia explosion is one that I can also use to illustrate that same concept. So you can pull them to find out what they're more familiar with and use the more proper example to discuss those things. Again, I've spoken about the on-the-fly slides. They really love the preparing for exams. In the past, when I would do an exam review, I would use a PowerPoint-based Jeopardy style game. All right? What's the problem with that? What's the problem with testing students' knowledge in a format like that where one student can answer at a time? Mm-hmm. Right. You get 2 or 3 students that really know, that really study beforehand, they dominate the responses, they're the ones standing out, popping up, getting all the points for their team. What's different about TurningPoint for exam reviews? Okay. Every student responds to every question, so they really can test their comprehension before the test if you do a midterm review with them. And so I found this is something that they love, especially in these large lecture classes where there's less interplay. They can't really ask the instructor about certain concepts as much. So they love being able to answer every question and see where they're at on every question rather than just sitting there passively and letting Susie Smartypants stand up and answer all the questions in the class. And so that's something that these response cards really allow us to do well. Sorry. Managing the list, again, that's something that can be very helpful, and you can base your entire class off of that if you're so inclined, and your different reporting options, PowerPoint, Excel, and WebCT. All right, so what I want to do to finish up my presentation here is talk about the recap and some assessment results. I did kind of an informal assessment at the end of the semester, last semester, at the end of our first semester of implementation, to see how the students were perceiving TurningPoint. I'll get my information here. And so what I did was I got a convenience sample. I'd hoped to get all 1,600 students to do this, but we ended up having a huge snowstorm the last week of classes, and so the day that the evaluation was usually done was snowed out. So I was able to get a few people that did this during their final exam time, and so I was able to get a sample of a couple hundred students, which isn't bad. It's not bad, so we can kind of see some trends from there. This provides insight into the student view of clickers, and the main thing that I found from this that I'm going to pursue in some research this semester is the student view of response cards differs based on the amount of times it's used in class. So this is the data that I found. Overall, for all the students that I polled, the 200 or so students, I asked them to give their response to this question. I enjoyed using clickers during class this semester. So the overall sample, 58% agreed or strongly agreed that they enjoyed using clickers during class this semester. The break lines seem to be the instructors that used these 3 or fewer times and the instructors that used them 4 or more times over the course of the semester. So when I broke this down by instructors that used it 4 or more times, I find that agree or strongly agree goes up to 76%. So a trend that I find is the more often you use these, the more students like them, the more comfortable they are with them, the more they enjoy using them. My next slide, I feel as though I would have learned more without using clickers. I had to negatively word this slide so they didn't get used to doing the same response. We didn't have that response repetition. So disagree on this slide indicates that they learned more. So overall, 40% said that they learned more, 43% were neutral. Again, this is students' reporting of their own learning, so it's not necessarily as accurate as a pen and paper measure would be. But you can see that 40% of them think that they learned more by using the clickers. When we go to the 4 more use folks, that goes up to 50% agree and 40% neutral. All right, so you can see their perception of their own learning increases when they use these more times, their perception of their learning with using these. The next question I asked was, I felt more able to participate in class with a clicker than in my classes that don't use them. And again, remember, this is in the small class setting, not the large lecture class setting. So I think there would probably be a big difference between feeling able to participate in a large lecture hall. I think you would feel a lot more able to participate with the response cards than you would in the small class. So again, this is in the small class. Overall, they still gave 58% agreement that they were more able to participate with the clicker. So even in the small classroom, they found that these were able to enhance their participation. For more uses, it goes even higher, up to 68% felt that they were more able to participate in class. So these could be your students that maybe have some communication apprehension, don't want to raise their hand and talk during class, but still want to give feedback and input. These clickers allow them to bypass those barriers and allow them to participate in class. So I was actually kind of surprised that it was this high in a small classroom, because those are by nature participative classrooms, but 68% is, I think, a pretty significant number there. Right? I asked them if they had a choice, would they sign up for a section of class that used clickers over a section that did not? So would that influence their choice? And didn't find as strong a numbers here. 32% agreed, 42% were neutral. There are a lot of things that go into whether students sign up for a class or not. So the fact that this isn't a determining factor isn't necessarily that surprising, but you can see the results do skew positively towards that. When you use them more often, it goes up to 38% agree that they would rather have a class that used clickers versus 49% neutral. So, and again, these are first semester students, first time using these devices. So, and what we found here is the more they use them, the more they like them. So it would stand to reason that if they use them a couple more times for a couple more classes, then this number could go up by the end of the time that they've used the clickers in their collegiate career. All right, so that's the data that I have and the information that I have.